Welcome to today's social system mapping deep dive session for April 20th, 2020. And hopefully I didn't mess that up because I didn't approve the recording. Okay, so today we're going to have, your hosts today are me, Christine Capra, co-founder of Greater Than the Sum and sumApp, and the other co-founder is Tim Hansen with the black and white tree background. In our session today. Our other host for today is Phil Metzler, who's the director of the Community Resilience Guild, and we'll let him introduce himself more in a couple minutes. This is just to orient you in where we are in the overall grand scheme of things. sumApp, Greater Than the Sum, we do 3 monthly sessions at the same time every Monday, the second, third, and fourth Monday of every month. The first one is an on-ramp session. For those of you who are new to all of this, the on-ramp session is a great place to start to get introduced to what is social system mapping. We always have someone in the community share one of their social system maps. So if you just are like, I need to see what this is before I understand it, which is kind of part of the point, is seeing what it is. That's a great time to join. And then, but at the on-ramp sessions, we sort of keep it at the sort of beginning level, and we often come up with topics that need further discussion that we want to dig into and spend some more time on. So those we do on the third Monday, which is the deep dive conversation. Today, the deep dive conversation is going to be about ideas that people have been bubbling up about responses, ways of mapping to support responses to COVID-19. And then on the fourth Monday of every month, we have what we call a tech talk, where we present a feature or a functionality of sumApp that either we see a lot of people running into trouble with, or we think could be more utilized, but people just don't know about it. So next Monday, the tech talk will be about how to load pre-existing data. A lot of people come to their mapping projects with a set of data about their map members that they would like to not have to ask the members again. So they want to sort of streamline the process, which means getting data into sumApp, and we're going to talk more about the challenges of that and how to do that next Monday. Today, we're going to do what we just did, greetings and review. Then we're going to do some introductions in the chat. Then Phil is going to present some use cases that he came up with, and a really cool sort of platform for sharing those use cases around various possible responses to COVID in his own community. After that, we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers with Phil. Then we'll break you out into small groups to talk about your own ideas about use cases, and then we'll come back, and I'm not sure there'll be a ton of time for discussion, but we'll have a larger group discussion. Especially asking people who are familiar with social system mapping to talk about their own thoughts about using mapping for responding to COVID. Thing we generally do, not always, but most of the time, is we've scheduled an hour. At the top of the hour, we pause so that whomever only wants to spend an hour with us and needs to go on to their next piece of their day we can have a formal break at the top of the hour. But we do usually stick around for an extra half hour for informal discussion. So if you have more questions or something inspired you and you just want to pick somebody's brains that is still around, mine, Tim's, Phil's, whomever else is still around, feel free to continue on after that, top of the hour. Okay, so for introductions, we're gonna do a chat, kind of an introduction. And so I'm gonna ask you all to open up the chat. Hopefully everybody's, I had not thought about what if somebody doesn't know how to deal with the chat. So I'm going to trust that they do. And if you don't, maybe if you could message Kara and she can help you figure out how to access the chat. But so let's go into the chat and start with just each person putting in their name, their pronoun, and their location. And then we'll hit enter, and we'll take just a moment to see where everybody's hailing from. Fayetteville, Arkansas, Seattle, Baltimore, Ashland, Boulder, more Minneapolis, Toronto. Then let's put in the chat, finish this sentence. If only we understood more about or could see more clearly, especially relative to this time.
Okay.
Someone's from Armenia. Okay. Oops.
Okay.
So if anybody knows who's got that voice in the background and wouldn't mind muting, that'd be great. Next question. No, before we go to the next question, let's just take a pause and read what each other's written. And think about what are the patterns that we see here. Yes, Michael, totally. Michael says, how we could use this spiritually liminal moment as a portal through ritual and practice. Very.
Where do you write your answer?
In the chat. This, if you look on, are you finding the chat? If you look on your little bottom of your dashboard, there's either a chat bubble icon or a 3-dot ellipsis icon.
Okay.
Do you see, can you find the chat? Seeing
Yes.
it? Okay. And so this is where everybody's comments are.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So, nice. Okay, third question. It makes me, finish that sentence. Welcome, Jim. Yes. And I'm pausing to read everyone's comments, and I hope you all are also, once you're done putting your comment in. Oh, yes. Sorry to hear that, Michael. So it seems like two very different, I'm seeing two patterns, one of grief and anger and disappointment at the state the world is already in before we got to COVID. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, hope and optimism that this can be a turning point. So how do we hold those two together and take the one and use it to manifest the other? Okay, last question. When all is said and done, I like that, Phil. What stories will we tell? It's a good question. Yes. Yeah. Thank you all. So I think our, one of the major questions for today is, there's of course a whole lot of ways we can take our intent that is apparent in these comments, our intent to use this as a transition point, as a threshold point, and come out of it stronger in some ways and more compassionate and more equitable, and perhaps more ready and prepared to deal with all the issues that existed that we needed to deal with before COVID came along, such as climate change, et cetera. And so there's lots of ways of doing that. And for today, our question is, are there ways that we can use mapping, the kind of social system mapping where we're asking, we're getting input from people, the members of the network, and showing their relationships. Is there a way, how can that particular tool support all of these other approaches to getting us through this time? So I'm going to hand it over. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand it over to Phil. And Phil can introduce himself a little bit and then share with us the stuff that he and I talked about a few weeks ago and decided to share with you. And I'm not even seeing you, Phil.
Yeah. No, thank you, Christine, very much for that introduction and for this opportunity, and to everyone for that sharing. I'm really touched and impressed and moved by that. It's diving into this much closer to where I started in terms of my own contribution here with this presentation, but yeah, so I just need to catch my breath, and this is a more meaningful way I feel to enter into this conversation than coming at it from the more technical questions or things I've been asking myself of how am I going to present this and kind of communicate this. I'm just going to try to build off of how you all have set the table here, and just to try to be fully present for this and offer you know, how I reacted to some of these same questions initially. So I'm the director of a small nonprofit in Indiana called the Community Resilience Guild. That is essentially sums up our mission, is to help build community resilience in our local context, which is a very broad proposition. And you know, it's, as a guild, we are a group of people that share that common interest and have tried to, you know, support each other in different ways in our own individual work in our community, and also our collective efforts. So I will honestly say, though, that when this, you know, thinking about building community resilience was always a kind of a longer term proposition, you know, with an eye towards these impending and converging crises. How do we contribute to that? So when this crisis happened and all of these things have converged, we generally felt completely unprepared or ill-equipped to really respond in the most meaningful ways we could. So we were left with these questions of, well, what can we bring to the needs that we're hearing around us, and what are some of the tools that we might be able to offer to our community, you know, in response to these new needs that people are trying to navigate. For me personally, connecting and sense making are very much central to kind of how I see my work or my vocation, so to speak. And so mapping is a very large component of that, helping you know, make sense of complexity or connect the dots in ways that engage others in seeing our reality through different lenses and through different perspectives. So I've been aware of sumApp for a while now. Have done more maps in terms of like concept maps and stakeholder mapping and that kind of thing than I have of network mapping and social system mapping. This was actually in some ways a chance where I had time to dive into this and play with this as a tool perhaps more than I have in the past, but also try to put it to use in some different ways. As we've been talking with people in our community, we heard a number of different needs coming up around this theme that we're all facing of social isolation and separation in ways that we haven't experienced it before. So, you know, that is this tremendous overarching challenge that brings, you know, this need for connectivity and this opportunity to help connect people right to the forefront. So I think that there's an awareness of that need and maybe an attraction to that need, that there is an opportunity for us to address. In my case, I was hearing from people, the operator or an educator at our local Boys and Girls Club saying, okay, now all of a sudden they're working remotely and the kids aren't coming into the club. How do they stay in touch with these kids and make sure that they're all being frequency? We're in the Midwest. It's a very large faith-based component, lots of churches in our community. And that's an ongoing sense of or place of connection for many people. That is kind of their main community outside of their household. And pastors are overloaded then with having to stay connected to their congregation or continue to check in with people in new ways. Some churches are setting up care committees, trying to respond to this in different ways, but how do they do that as efficiently as possible? And neighborhoods, of course, are these wonderful locuses of compassion and caring as well that we're seeing emerge. And how do we help neighborhoods look out for each other and care for each other as effectively as possible? So hearing some of those different use needs, I was playing around with this idea of how could a tool like sumApp or how could mapping help address those. And as I kind of brainstormed a little bit with people, what was immediately evident was that, yeah, it kind of resonated, but they really had a hard time envisioning what that might entail. How could a tool help? Some people could imagine a spreadsheet or a database, or a spreadsheet that would help people keep track of things more effectively, more systematically. But a map was kind of beyond what people could conceive. And so just showing people like Kuma maps wasn't going to get very far. So I decided just to create some use cases and test it out, which was a way for me to kind of get more familiar with sumApp and get more familiar with what this might look like. So I'm going to share my screen and put up a website that I put together to highlight all of these. And actually, I'm going to make sure, did the website ever get shared, Christine, that you know of?
No, and I was just going to ask you if it was okay for, so I'll put the link to that website in the chat right now.
I just did it privately. Here, I've got it, Christine.
It's okay, go ahead and share and
there we go. So anybody can look, you can look at what I'm sharing, or you can go directly to that. But basically what I did is I just created a Google site to just introduce some of the ideas that we were putting out there to make them as accessible as possible, to embed the Kumu maps that we were creating, and to share, to narrate kind of what sumApp as a tool could bring to this unique case that we were looking at. So this is meant to be a kind of a landing space for somebody that has heard about this tool being offered. It's definitely not tailored to our community. The part of the interest and motivation for putting this together was knowing that we were going to have this conversation, and that there might be people in other places that could take this and use it in different ways or bring other ideas. So this is basically the presentation then, is just kind of walking you through this. But it's simply a way to just kind of introduce to people, again, this idea that these circumstances invite us to think about how we look out for everyone in our zone of care in different ways. And so I tried to kind of elaborate on each of these ideas a little bit here. This was kind of a one-off thing, so there's plenty of room for improvement, but hopefully it conveys some of the intentions here. Introducing sumApp is what I think really brings to it that, you know, just doing a spreadsheet or, you know, a one-off map would do is this emerging um, dynamic sense of connectivity. The way that not having to have everybody set up their own accounts, but just giving people their own link that they can track their connections to other people over time was a really powerful tool that goes, I think, beyond what people were imagining even existed. So that was what I was really trying to play off of in terms of thinking about how it could be applied to these different use cases. One of the things is that each case kind of has its own, is likely to have its own kind of emphasis, or is this a question of frequency of connection, perhaps? Or is it a question of the quality of connection that's being, managed over a given period of time? For that's going to, and it's going to look very differently depending on who is using the map. Like for instance, in the case of a youth group, it might just be 1 or 2 leaders who are using this map to just keep track together of how they are connecting with all of their youth. Whereas in the case of a neighborhood, it might want to be seeing how each of the neighbors are connecting to each other and seeing that collective picture emerge over time. So I will try to keep an eye out here for questions if they come up, and make sure I'm not going too fast or missing anything. What I would be curious to hear of is whether or not any of these use cases that I've described actually resonate perhaps more than the others that we could dive into, and I can just kind of share how we adapted sumApp to serve here in this case.
And I actually wanted to try a poll. Kara, do you have access to the polling tool? I thought it would be fun for us to test that out. It should take just a minute if Kara can find it. Because
Okay, so while you're doing that, then I'll just quickly wrap up to a point where I can end the screen share for a minute at least.
So 1 second, Phil. So, okay, so you should see a little poll popped up on your screen. You just say which use case you want Phil to dig into, and click submit, then we'll do that. So Phil, sorry to interrupt. You can wrap up while we're all taking the poll. Is everybody seeing the poll? Just want to, okay, so go ahead and fill it in, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I'll simply wrap up this first page then with, we basically just set this up so that we could give somebody a link if it was spread by word of mouth or anyone we talked to directly, and then just set up a simple, Google form that people could indicate then what interests they have, what use case they might be imagining, or what context they were thinking of using it in, and then we could follow up and have a conversation from there. So, and
let's take 30 more seconds to do the poll, and then Kara can tell us the answer. But I just want to interject here that one of the things that when I saw what Phil had done, I was really impressed with, because one of the things we all struggle with, I hear from everybody over and over, is things about like how do we demonstrate the value of sumApp and Kumu and social system mapping, and how do we help people even understand what it is? Like that leap from imagination to something that we can engage with has been a really big leap for so many of us, and especially without having like Tim and I now have a portfolio of maps, client maps that we've done that we can sort of walk people through. But without that, how do you do this? And this, I was just impressed with the framework and the scaffolding that Phil put around this concept, and just made up some examples with dummy data, but he really did it in a way that sort of tied it all together and helped people learn as they were digging through it. So I just thought that was really great and wanted to share that. Do we have a response to which poll or which use case to jump into a little more?
Yes, please take us through the neighborhoods.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so that's definitely the most complex of them. See if I can get, got too many windows open, I have to move things around. So this is the neighborhood use case. And for each of these, I try to give a bit of a narrative of, what this might actually be addressing, or how it might need to be used. All of these, was assuming that the people using this would not actually have to be using sumApp necessarily, that back end interface would be facilitated for them. So really what they would need to do though is start with a spreadsheet that would have all the names and whatever information is most relevant. In this case, just generated a generic list of what 400 people, you know, with families, that's obviously much fewer in terms of households. So, I mean, in terms of sumApp, it was just simply a spreadsheet that would have the names, an email, which would be useful if you were sending it out, but it wouldn't have to be, information wouldn't have to be gathered by email. But this just at least creates a placeholder for each participant. You know, are people adults, children, part of a neighborhood association? Are they seniors or in some other category that warrants special care and attention? The segmenting allows that to be facilitated very easily. And by identifying what families people belong to, it's much easier to see how people are more deeply connected on the map beyond just the social connections that people might be identifying. In this case, just imagine that because of the survey functionality that sumApp brings, it makes perfect sense to ask, what are people needing? What are people experiencing? What do people have to offer? So taking a more asset-based approach as well as getting to the real needs that might be expressed. This is a tool that immediately then would allow somebody to share vital information with the community. So I kind of went through and just, you know, I appreciate how the sumApp interface by default is set up to look at social networks. In this case, that's not the framework people are necessarily arriving at with. So how do we tweak the questions and use them to serve slightly different purposes? So this goes into that somewhat, you know, thinking about what questions might be asked. But ultimately, and if the purpose of this map is just to gauge who's connected to who, so that if there needed to be an outreach of communication or some kind of effort, what might guide that, who's most connected, who's least connected. The idea was to create a picture of that at least a central group of leaders might use. So the questions that I kind of posed here are whether somebody has met a neighbor, whether they're in communication, whether they're in regular contact or could be in regular contact during the stay-at-home order or whatever, and use that information to both individually and collectively start to get a picture of what's happening. So by having these family units identified, as opposed to just individuals, the red dots that you see are families, it creates a very different dimension to the maps. And let me see here. So if you looked at all of these different types of connection, you're going to see a very you know, large map with relatively few households that weren't connected by anybody. I kind of started off by imagining that if there were 20 people or a dozen people that were part of a neighborhood association and they just did this themselves to see what level of connectivity they were starting with, then they might be able to see who are some of the outliers. You know, are they engaging the whole community and trying to get each neighbor involved, or are they just doing this from a central point of control? However this plays out, you know, this is all hypothetical. I mean, clearly say we don't have groups using this in our community at present. You know, we kind of have put this out there, and there are any number of dynamics that are, you know, we have to overcome to actually engage people in using this now. But my hope or my intention, besides using this as a learning opportunity for myself, was to put this out there, considering that maybe other people in other locations would find a use for it. So it's not just relevant to us. These are just images of the Kumu map. I can switch over to that, but it's just showing that as we filter out and focus, well, we don't want to know just who knows each other, who's actually in communication here and now. That gives us a tighter sense of connectivity. You can start to clearly see then, okay, that sphere of connection is limited, more limited than we thought. And so that might be a motivation then to start reaching out to individual families or engaging the rest of the community to collectively engage in filling out their own connection maps. So let's see, the one of the things that this is, okay, now I'm remembering that I actually have a different Kumu map for each of these. So I'm sorry, I would have to go back into to pull up the neighborhood map, and this is probably going to be too slow to do. So hopefully you have access to the maps through the link that was provided and you can explore them there. But one of the things that could be done then would be to show the mapping based on the survey data, you know, so you would be able to cluster residents around who is offering a particular skill or resource, or who is in need of a specific, who has a specific need, whether it's getting prescriptions filled or grocery delivery or, you know, home project, what have you. Yeah, the maps could present different data depending on what was ultimately needed by the residents.
Yeah. So Phil, can you just briefly tell us what your vision is for how I know you've shared this with a few people in your community. If there's like what your vision is for how you, if and how you intend to help move, like facilitate moving this forward or start trying to get to actual adoption from components of the now.
Sure. For me, a lot of the time is still rooted in just talking with people, meeting independently and just checking in, hearing where they're at, not trying to show up with a tool and trying to pitch it to them or sell it to them. I think there's a lot of fatigue right now, a lot of overwhelm, and I just being patient with that and sensitive to that and not trying to impose something. I think trusting that this is something that might just take time to trickle out and find resonance with someone that's in a position to help offer this, you know, if not being, you know, that neighborhood leader or that leader of a faith community that would be close enough to them that they could offer this as something that would potentially be helpful. So this was, I think this was kind of like, had the time and the opportunity, the privilege of creating this and putting this out there and seeing what happens and being okay with that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Phil. So just to clarify for the rest of the group, we shared the link, and part of the offer here is that we can figure out, Phil, maybe you not right now, but we'll figure out how like we can help people clone it or take the work you've done and adapt it for their own context, or just plain use this example to share with other people. So feel free to build on what Phil's done. And what I want to do now is break us up into small groups and have you, so Kara will break us up into groups of 3, and conversation. The questions are, in what context? So given this time of separation and isolation and a heightened sense of the need for connection, in what context have you thought of might mapping connections help support responses to COVID-19? So what are some of the use cases that are in your own thoughts and imagination, and how or why might mapping those be useful in those contexts? So we'll have Kara break us up. What you'll see is, as she's getting ready, as she hits go, you'll have a little pop-up that will say, you know, we're going to take you into breakout room X. Just go ahead and say okay, or I agree, or whatever the affirmative is, and it will take you into a small group. We'll give you 10 minutes in the small groups together to talk about your own use case ideas and how they could be helpful, and then we'll bring you back. Okay? But hopefully most of you got to have a conversation, and what I want to do now is have you, let's go back to the chat and put in a use case or context that you either shared with others or heard about from others that felt like a compelling possibility for mapping. We'll just do that one question. inviting you at this time to be typing in the chat box if you feel so inclined, and share a compelling use case that you heard about or thought of. Okay. So thanks, everyone. This is all really valuable thinking, and it just always, when we have these conversations, I just always feel really honored that we get to be sort of tech support for and tool creator for all the people who are thinking the way you all are about all the important initiatives and not just change projects, but thinking, changing paradigms, changing mindsets. That we get to support that is something I'm grateful for every day, and that we get to work with people like you all is an honor to me. So I just want to say that as I'm reading the chats, how much I appreciate that. Wanted to give, and as always, everything fills up more time than you anticipate. I wanted to take a few minutes for the people who are part of this session who have been doing mapping, who are pretty familiar with sumApp, Kumu, social system maps, to hear your thoughts about either context that you've been thinking about using social system mapping for supporting COVID responses, or challenges that you see in implementing. We only have a few minutes for that, so maybe I'll just ask for two of you to offer to talk for a minute or two, and then we'll limit it. And there's a couple people I'm thinking of specifically. Narayan is working on a big project, and Jim, I know you've sort of been in lots of places with mapping and have probably touched on contexts that it could feel useful to. So I'm just going to make that decision. But Narayan, let's start with you. I'd love to hear what you're struggling with right now in that project. And you're muted. Okay, good.
Yeah. So for a bit of context, I'm working with a 5,000 person Slack organization. Like, the whole thing is the fastest growing Slack in the world that they've ever had, connecting volunteers fighting coronavirus globally. And so we're trying to map what is actually going on with this. The need that we're trying to fill right now with this mapping is matching talent, like new volunteers, to teams that could exist, need to exist. And some of the big questions is we don't even know what teams need to exist. And so a lot of that is connecting one function to another in order to create a value chain. And so we're hoping to use that. The challenge is, how do we bring how do we sell this to the organization? I think in my smaller group, we were talking about that, like, how do you demonstrate value if it requires a bit of trust up front to get people to load their information in? Or what are other ways that we can load information in such that we can actually start to point at things and say, look, it's working, it's doing well.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. Just a comment. When I saw what Phil had done, I thought, oh, this could be at least a step in the getting trust. It's, it still requires a certain amount of trust, but it's short. It makes it a smaller step. Jim, have you had thoughts about COVID response and mapping?
I'm actually just being stimulated by what's happening here. I mean, just what Narayan just mentioned about building trust and building these chains. It seems to me that if you ask people to give a little bit of information, but show so much value, just like we're engaged in Facebook and stuff where we're giving all this personal information, it's because there's so much value and we're making that trade-off. So maybe you can do the same thing within your network where you encourage people to provide a little bit, but you show so much value that it draws them in further. The other, I'm just super excited with Phil's presentation here, that it's so accessible. The use cases allow people to sort of spin off in all these directions that are showing up in the chat and in our small breakouts. And I'm assuming you made the maps available because that's one of the map code, because that's one of the stumbling blocks. But I don't have anything other than that.
Right.
So we're at the top, almost to the top of the hour. I want to just add a couple comments. One is, if you're not in our Slack team, Kara, can you put the invitation to the Slack in the chat? You will also get a follow-up email, which will have the invitation to the chat. I see that an invitation to our Slack team. And the reason I'm saying that right now is I'm seeing people putting information in the chat, which about wanting to connect with others who are doing something similar. Mario, and one of the things that we have in the Slack team is we have a channel for each of these sessions. So if you join the Slack and go into the deep dive discussion channel and put that there, then we have a place that we will retain, and then we'll hopefully we'll try to hook you up or find other people that you can connect with, because I think this is really valuable to get what you're looking for. So Slack team invitation in the chat. You'll get a follow-up that will have a link to Phil's website that we shared with you, and whatever else is part of that. Also the Slack again, and a link to, I think that's it. I'm rambling. So let's do this. Let's have let's all unmute our phone, unmute our microphones, and we'll just say an appreciation or a word that expresses how you're feeling to the group right now. We'll do that all together, and then those of you who need to leave can jump off, and those of you who want to stick around for an extra half hour, stay put, and then we'll talk some more. So ready for your word. 3, 2, 1.
Connection.
We're grateful.
Exuberant.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll see you in Slack and everywhere else we see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.